Hi, I'm Siobhan,
I'm Annabel.
And I'm Anne.
and we are the Deal Divas, a podcast discussing all things negotiation.
Welcome to the first episode from the Deal Divas. Three women who negotiate every day in their commercial lives and their private lives, discussing all things negotiation.
Well, thank you, Anne. One of the things I love about when we were talking about launching this podcast is the range of experience that we all have, different industries, and it's quite fun now to just have this opportunity to share some of the highs and the lows, some of our triumphs, or maybe some things that we have learned from along the way with our different experiences and different techniques that we've kind of developed over time. And we were having an interesting conversation, weren't we, yesterday, about power dynamics and how that relates to the journeys we've experienced. And I suppose I can share, we were talking yesterday about when I went into a negotiation, and at that time I was in my early 20s and, young female. I was very enthusiastic. I was passionate about negotiation, and we were basically negotiating a contract with a much larger firm. They definitely had that position of power as far as their leverage, their funds, the contacts they had. And we wanted to basically get a 12 month to 2 year contract, and we wanted to position ourselves in a way that would launch our digital products internationally. And it'd been going very well. We'd done a test period. They were very happy. I'd been emailing back and forth. We'd never really had that many phone calls, and I think people can relate to that a lot now. With negotiating, so much is through email and online. And because they'd had a mixture of dealing with myself and my boss at the time, we'd got to that stage, but not yet met in person with me. They'd met my boss. And so we went to the table to negotiate finer details of the contract we were putting together. And I was a bit nervous, to be honest, because I was in my early 20s. And although I definitely knew my field and what we were doing, and I was, devoted to that project, it was a very interesting reaction I had when I walked into the room, because they actually asked me who I was and asked for Siobhan. And I had to tell them I was Siobhan, and they did make a comment about the fact that I was so young and that they were surprised that I was the one leading the project. And the dynamic was quite an intimidating room that I was taken to. It was a small meeting room, but it was, just males, and I was the only female. And it was a sort of industry where it's a bit more male dominated. We're going back quite a few years, so things have progressed so much now in that industry. But it was interesting how I felt the power dynamics shift when they realized I was so much younger than they expected. And so I thought that was interesting, since we were talking about yesterday, to maybe start to talk about that. How does people's perceptions or assumptions affect the negotiation, or how we feel as women? Thankfully, it is changing, though, isn't it, in various industries?
So how did it affect your ability to handle the situation?
Well, to be honest, I was in my early 20s. I didn't have the confidence that comes with more experience, and I didn't have the same skills that I have now. Although I had skills, they aren't what they are now. So I was a bit taken aback. I felt pretty shaky, to be honest. When you go to speak and your voice is a bit like quivery, and I was like, I just need some water, please. As if it was dehydration from the tube, and it was actually, I was just so intimidated. Bearing in mind, this was somebody who was renowned for shouting at people if they messed up. That was their style as a boss. So I was suddenly, and it probably wouldn't have happened because I wasn't their employee, but I was thinking, gosh, am I going to get shouted at? I was really scared of that. Or embarrassing myself, as I thought. So I was pretty shaky. I went in to try to discuss the deal we had on the table, go through the finer details. I think something I did well is I had prepared the data and the information about what we'd achieved to that point. The kind of the supporting information of the different elements of the deal, that was all clearly outlined, and that brought some credibility because it showed that I knew my stuff when it came to this particular contract. So I communicated that well, but I think I relied a bit too much on persuasion. And it's only when I saw them affirming multiple times, like, yes, that sounds like a good idea. Yes, that went very well. Yes, the test is very good. I then got my confidence back and almost forgot that first moment. Yeah, that's what happened.
So with the experience of hindsight, what would you say to your 20-something-year-old self if you could go back and give her some advice in that situation about how to manage it? What would you be saying to her?
Yeah, I think on one level, it was the confidence. Just to remain confident and literally slow down my breathing would have been a good thing, because I was suddenly breathing so short and getting visibly showing that I was nervous, which kind of fed into their stereotype of me. And at that, when he saw that I was a bit shook by it, he did ask, "Is my boss coming?" And he'd like to discuss the negotiation with my boss, which then made me feel even less credible to be at the table. So I think that vicious cycle of what I was thinking and my nerves, if I'd have prepared and maybe either they could have known ahead of time that I was a more junior, younger member of the team, since that was important to their company. They were all much older and had certain perspectives about younger people. And also maybe preparing myself that question might get mentioned.
What was
And
the what was the kind of the development of that situation? Did he eventually come round and start to treat you with credibility, or did you have to go and get your boss?
well, I responded to what he said and said how my boss wasn't coming, but I think I came across a bit shirty because I was like trying to be assertive and was feeling a bit nervous. So it did go well when I started to remind him of the fact that, what we're there to discuss, that my boss wouldn't be coming along, and the different elements of the deal that we're going to be focusing on. And I said, "So if you'd like to sit down, we could begin the meeting we've planned." And I sat myself down and he sat down after me. So I just kind of took the bull by the horns, as it were. And he realized I wasn't going to take any crap. So that was good. I think if I'd prepared a proper opening statement, that would have helped, because it would have just grounded me in certainty, that one moment that I could have known and had control of what was happening in that meeting. And I didn't do that. I think part of the reason why I didn't do that is because the sort of approach and style of the company that I was with at that time was to be more friendly, be more informal, be more chatty and talkative. So we were used to trying to create this relaxed vibe by not being formal. So I was kind of encouraged not to have like an opening statement, as it were. But there are ways that you can still present an opening statement without being overly formal. And I think that would have saved me if I'd have at least prepared something. It would have set the tone and shifted things from that very uncomfortable, them seeing my young face that looked, about 15 at the time. It
Well
did
done, you.
had a baby face, and it was just like, he's thinking, who is this child that's walked in? And where is this negotiator I've been emailing with and developing a business with? So a clear opening statement to help me reset the tone from that uncomfortable moment would have definitely improved how the negotiation went. And then also not relying so much on persuasion and getting the other person to be almost on my side. Actually, if you have a credible stance, it doesn't matter if you have the same perspectives or opinions as the other side. It's just about how can we work together to find a deal that is beneficial for both, rather than please like me and think that I'm good enough for my age, which was a bit of what was coming through lack of confidence back then.
And you did say at the outset that you were very well prepared in terms of the information. So once you got beyond that kind of challenging early interaction, you had all of the information available to give you that credibility that you need.
Yeah. And I prepared well for the deal, the negotiation, and, what prices we wanted, what payment terms, what timeframes, distribution, all this sort of stuff. But I hadn't thought, what presumptions might they be making about me, or the way I'll conduct myself, or the tone, or the approach they can take. And, he was known to be quite aggressive if he was made upset. So actually, it would have been good for me to have prepared, in hindsight now, and think, if the slightly competitive or aggressive or intimidating tone is brought in, how can I handle that? How can I be in my certainty and my confidence and not let that affect me? Not let that affect me. Yeah. So that's something I would do differently with hindsight, if I could kind of whisper in my younger self's ear.
Yeah. It's difficult though, and it really strikes me as you say that. In a way, why would you prepare for somebody being biased towards you. Why should you have to prepare for that? But I mean, we're dealing in realities here, but you wouldn't necessarily know that because you are well prepared. You know that you know what you're doing. You know that you've led the deal. Why would I prepare for that kind of situation? And it kind of reminds me, it's a bit further back, but my first job, real sort of proper job out of university, was working for an oil company, going out and about, sort of selling oil, brake fluid, really, great stuff, out and about, kind of classic, out in the Vauxhall Cavalier, win the bag. I was thrilled to get the job. When I got the job, there was, I think, 64 people in the sales force at that time. It was sort of the old days. And 3 of us were women, which kind of made for a really interesting Christmas party, I've got to tell you, but that's a whole other story on another podcast. But what was fascinating about it was that I did all the training, and classic story, just as you're describing, you've got to be all over everything, better than everybody to do this. So graduated kind of top of the class in brake fluid, which is an accolade, and went down into somewhere in Devon, which also remain nameless, and turned up at my first customer, went to the counter, chatted away. I mean, you couldn't make an appointment. They couldn't see me on LinkedIn, so they didn't have any perception. I just kind of rocked up and said, I'm your new lady from oil company. And they were perfectly pleasant about it all. And we had a decent discussion about lubricants, as you do. Can't even say it with a straight face now. And so fast forward, and I get back to the office, and I get a phone call to be told that apparently this person has phoned the office to complain that Company X has, quote, gone to the dogs because they've employed a woman to come and talk to him. And he was fine to my face, but that was actually the dynamic that was going on underneath. And I had all of this kind of just innate prejudice to overcome before I even got to talk about anything meaningful. And I don't know what I could tell my 20-something self about that, other than to an extent what you did and what I did, which is just tough it out, lady. Because I did in the end, and actually the end of the story is about 18 months later when I left that role. Just prior to that, there was some kind of charity banger race thing, and this guy owned one of these sort of stock car things, and he actually let me race it. We became quite good friends. So, it worked, but I have to work all the harder to try and achieve that. So I don't know, why would you prepare other than to be the person that you are to an extent? Does that, I don't know.
Yeah. I think fortunately in more recent years, things are shifting in quite a lot of industries, definitely not all industries, but thankfully some of that prejudice is easing up, and this kind of awareness that we have to be inclusive and we have to allow all voices to be heard and support each other is really helping. But you're totally right. Why should we have to work extra hard just because we're a female or our age or whatever it might be, any one factor?
And I know, things do move on, but I still get asked quite frequently, sometimes in one of the sessions on a course, somebody will, in session say, I have this issue because I'm young, because I'm female, I'm in a room full of older people. It's still an issue. Not necessarily in the sense that, we are more inclusive, but it comes back to this unconscious kind of sense of bias that we're trying to overcome. But, you bring it about yourself sometimes by making that own assumption that you are the younger one at the table, and what are my strategies to handle it? And like you say, having a really convincing opening, knowing your stuff inside out, all the good stuff that we would do. But I guess sometimes you've just got to let time take its course. And it's perhaps idealistic to suggest that people will just remove that sense of any kind of intuition right from the get-go. I don't know.
It's interesting, and I think you're right. Things are shifting, but for those of us who have negotiated for a long time and been around this kind of commercial environment for a while, there is kind of the legacy that I think we carry ourselves from when things weren't so evolved and when there wasn't quite the awareness of that sort of bias, be it conscious or unconscious, that a lot of women do still experience. I remember years and years ago, I was relatively new in my career, but it was the first kind of big gig I'd got with the business I worked for. And I was sent overseas, and I was sent first of all to Israel for a while, and then I went to work in Turkey. And I remember walking into a strategy meeting, which I was hosting and holding. And I walked into the room. I was still relatively young. I was in my early 30s. And it was a room full of much older, seasoned kind of dogs, if you will, of negotiators. And they were all male. And I walked in and they were perfectly pleasant. I could see they were a little bit taken aback, and there was a slight kind of cultural overlay to that. But nevertheless, because of the experiences I'd had to that point, I felt that they were thinking things that perhaps they weren't thinking. I don't know, but I felt the first kind of thing that was going through my head was, they think I'm young, they're conscious I'm female, they think I can't possibly know what I'm talking about, and all of that kind of negative self-talk. And I remember in that situation frankly being quite intimidated, and I thought I did what I always do when I feel a bit intimidated, which is go to the toilet. And I shut the door and I kind of took a deep breath, and I thought, where is the issue here? Is it them or is it me? And when I actually thought about it, it was the self-talk that was going through my head. And I think if I could advise myself now, it would be about having the confidence. And part of that comes from a lot of the stuff that we talk about, like, understanding structure and having some skills available to use, and planning your opening statement, and all of those things, and all of those tools that I would now use to anchor my confidence around. Certainly as you get older and you get much more experience, then I think that these things hold less of a fear. But really, it was very much the sort of self-talk that was going on in my head, rather than, a bunch of kind of really angry guys sort of having a go at me, as it were.
I think it's odd, because it's one of those things where there is an element to which age and experience, comes into play in all of that. But I have to say, I went to a meeting not so long ago, which has somewhat gone down in folklore as being, possibly the worst meeting that I think I've ever experienced in my entire life. And I think just because I was unprepared for the fact that I would be met with such aggression, I guess, to be frank. And the interesting part is I was with a colleague. They were sort of leading the meeting. I was along to ride shotgun. And we had been led to believe that it was going to be an informal chat, and we're going to meet, a few of the sort of potential audience that we might be training to get their perspective. And then we'd have about 10, 15 minutes with maybe one of the more senior people. And now, names have been changed to protect the innocent. This is in one of those sectors that you anticipate being quite aggressive. They're kind of renowned for being quite aggressive negotiators. But the irony was that, we'd been approached to talk to them about how they might adopt new approaches, new, more collaborative ways of working, because they felt that they perhaps weren't always getting the best from their suppliers by adopting these principles. And instead, when we arrived at the meeting, we were walked along the corridor. It was all very chatty, all very nice. Did you see the football, etc., etc.? And then we're led into a room where we were ambushed, is the only word that I can use to describe it, by about 10 senior people who'd put themselves in a sort of horseshoe formation and literally sat us in the middle in an attempt to kind of, I don't know, intimidate, whatever, put us off guard. I really don't know. But then proceeded to ask a lot of really kind of aggressive questions. And, I'm supposed to be a negotiator. I'm supposed to be able to handle this. And even so, my colleague and I struggled with the sheer level of aggression. And, I played it out in my mind lots of times afterwards. And I just wish that I had at some point stopped the meeting, effectively said to them, can I just, ask you, what's going on, as it were? What's happening in this meeting? Because I'm, quite kind of thrown by, I am at a loss to understand quite why we're adopting the approach that we're adopting. We were led to believe we work well with you in the States. You wanted to know more about how we do things. I don't understand the strategy that you are adopting. Now, I don't think gender had anything to do with it, I point out. I think it's just an adopted way of behaving. And sometimes you're going to find yourself on the receiving end of it. And I say, I'd love to say I handled it beautifully. I don't think I did. I think I was quite taken aback by it because I was just so ill prepared to handle that kind of tactic. But, people do that. They do try to. The phrase I hear all the time is, we wanted to get them on the back foot. I don't know if you ever
Yes.
hear that.
Yeah.
I
wish
hear
Yeah.
that a lot. Yeah.
had a pound or a euro or whatever for every time somebody said, "Oh, well, I wanted to get them on the back foot." And my question is always, why? Why did you want them on the back foot? Because I have to tell you, that was one of the most unconstructive meetings I've ever had in my existence. They didn't get what they wanted from the meeting. We certainly didn't get what we wanted for the meeting, other than a story that I can recount some way down the line as still being the worst meeting, and probably will remain the worst meeting I've ever been to. Interestingly, I met one of the participants down the line, one of the people from the meeting down the line, and I didn't know if she remembered me. And so I sort of said, "Hi," we shook hands. She said, "Do I know you?" And I said, "Yes, I was at an interesting meeting a while ago." I left it at that. So we got past it because we did do business with them in the end. But it's just such a strange experience.
And it's interesting because it doesn't have to be gender at all. We're talking here about power dynamics, and it can be, a group like that feeling that they have all the power, or it can be a gender thing, but it doesn't have to be, absolutely.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how people perceive power dynamics in negotiations and how that comes into the strategy that people prepare. It's been interesting when you talk about like intimidation. I was speaking with somebody who was negotiating in a very different industry. I'm purposely being non-specific. And they literally said how they were told that the strategy was, you sit down and greet the person and start the meeting, and then I'm gonna bang the door open. This wasn't a company I worked with. Bang the door open, shout, I'm fed up with this. We're not going to take this crap anymore. Storm in, shout at you to get this sorted, and then I'm going to storm out, and the young person they've sent will be so scared you'll get a much better deal. And that was the approach. And they did it every time with every new supplier.
It's crazy, isn't it? It's interesting. A company I worked for, a very large global multinational, well known actually for being quite aggressive in its approach, used to have this strategy where they would have negotiator A would negotiate with the supplier. And they would get the supplier so far along the line, they would keep them in a meeting for an endless amount of time. And then they would say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I've got to go to another meeting, but here's my colleague, fresh, new to it all, and they'll take over the negotiation." And the supplier who's already kind of exhausted and feels that they're almost there has got to recount the whole thing. And the idea was that they would just kind of physically wear this person or these suppliers down by, dragging it out with a hope of getting a better deal. And we certainly didn't as a result of that behavior. And it was interesting because the behavior and carrying out that behavior almost became more important than achieving the overarching objective. It was like sticking to this kind of manipulative game plan was the most important thing in the meeting. The most important thing wasn't achieving the end goal or the objective. I remember one of my colleagues used to have a phrase, and he said, "Do I want to be right or do I want to be rich?" In other words, do I want to kind of win the argument or pursue my objective to the end goal, to pursue my strategy to the end goal, or do I want to actually achieve my objective? And I think that's
it's very true. And I think that what sometimes happens is that they get so used to doing it that way that they don't even question whether you do it that way. That's the first thing. And then one of the things that I think has been really apparent over the last few years, being around negotiations frequently, is the overriding shift in power dynamics. Things like supply shortages and inflation have just changed that marketplace. And people have been still trying to employ the same tactics that they did when they had more power in a marketplace where they no longer have it. Kind of thumping the table and demanding is great, but if they haven't got it, they haven't got it. So that ability to adapt to a new circumstance, I think, is key. And there is a remarkable lag involved, I think, sometimes, in doing that. Likewise, offering volume in a marketplace where there isn't enough to go around. It doesn't. You need another string to your bow in order to do that. But
I think the pandemic's created the post-pandemic world now. That whole time has created a slight shift in the dynamic, because the way that people used to operate doesn't necessarily work in the same way.
And I think we find that, don't we? It kind of really starts to separate, I think, much clearer now, at least from my experience and maybe from yours too, the skilled negotiators versus the people that unfortunately maybe haven't had the opportunity to get a range of skill. And so then, I had that as in my earlier career, where you just do the style of the company or your boss or your manager. We used to do a lot of good cop, bad cop stuff. And then, you have suddenly, like you shared, there's a shift in the market or in the supply chain or a worldwide pandemic, would you believe? And suddenly everything's changed and they're ready at the school gates to come and get you for the pain you put them in. And actually being a more skilled negotiator and having a range of tools and techniques so you can actually trade, not bully people into negotiations, allows you to be agile. It's kind of survival of the fittest, actually survival of the most adaptable and flexible and agile, I think.
I agree, and it's hard to argue sometimes with, because you say, well, I'm not trying to take the moral high ground. If those techniques are working for you, then who am I to argue? Sometimes I feel like saying, not condoning kind of bullying in any way, but that sort of sense of if you're being aggressive, as it were, assertive, and it's working, then that's fine. But as you say, if it's not working, then how do I move to something else? And I think people sometimes they don't stop to ask themselves, is my behavior backed up by the power behind it? Because if it's not, frankly, it's just noise. And that noise is actually remarkably easy to just kind of let it waft over me and say, right, as you say, let's just be rich instead. Let's suck up the persuasion and be rich instead. So it is interesting, that we talk about, constantly analysing the power balance. Just because it was like it was 5 years ago, it may not be like that today. And that sort of interesting shift, I think, it's been really interesting, I think, for us, for Scotwork, to be part of that over the last few years, because it has represented a shift. And I was pitching for some business a while ago to a finance director who knows Scotwork. He'd been through a course some years back, and I said to him, the world's changed, and a lot of people out there used to just thump the table and say, I'm the buyer, do it my way. And there was this sort of awkward silence, and he said to me, you've got me. And that's why he was at the table.
What I was going to do.
He didn't know what to do because it was a different place that we were in. So, it's been really interesting to be part, and difficult and challenging for people, I think.
Quite often I hear people saying on the course, well, I'm on the receiving end of those tactics. How do I respond to it? And I think one of the things that's helpful to try and get a handle on is, why are people behaving like that? Are they behaving in that way because it's been rewarded behavior in the past? When they beat suppliers up, when they behave badly, they get a reward for it. So, I always say to people, the first thing is, don't reward people for bad behavior. But then if they do start to behave better, try and reward the better behavior, because you're trying to encourage that. Or, what's going on behind it? Is there something else that lies behind it? And to your point, Annabel, in that meeting, it's almost worth taking a step back and saying, look, can we just take a step back here and, help me understand why we're in this, why this environment is the way it is.
Yeah. Absolutely, 100%.
I say it's so often just what you touched on earlier, Anne, about like strategy and different strategies people take. And I'm sometimes amazed by the amount of times people confuse their objective with their strategy. They forget what they're actually trying to achieve, and it becomes all focused around the how. And they've forgotten where they're trying to arrive at. And so many times when we're like analysing deals or working with people, it's like people's language and clarity around the difference between an objective and a strategy is often so confused and intertwined, and really differentiating and understanding the clear difference, and that you need to be flexible with your strategy but clear on your objective. It's interesting that, like you said, taking a step back in that difficult meeting you had, Annabel, looking back now all these years and being like, wait a minute, what's the objective we want to achieve here? Like, the intimidation is clearly the strategy, but what are we all trying to achieve?
For what?
Yeah.
Yeah,
What's the
absolutely.
outcome? How's
I
that going to
think
help you?
there's something in there about very often the objective is set by the organization. The strategy may well be developed by the individual or by a team of individuals. And I think once you've got that kind of almost emotional buy-in to something, it's like, it's mine. So I'm going to
Mhm.
pursue it at all costs.
Yeah.
This strategy was my idea. And I think it is quite challenging for people to say, well, look, this obviously isn't working. Let's just step back,
Mm.
check our objectives are still relevant and appropriate, and find another way.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to get wedded to our own strategy. This,
Yeah.
this is the way I wanted to do it, and kind of keep
Yeah.
constantly pursuing that at all odds.
Yeah.
It's
I
that
guess.
emotional investment, isn't it? You get emotionally invested
Exactly,
in something.
exactly.
Yeah.
I know, like, coming from a very competitive family, we always like trying to beat each other because I've got 5 older brothers. It
Oh,
was like,
right.
I was always trying to prove I'm just as good as you, It's like trying to compete with them at all the wrong stuff. They were such bigger and more athletic than I was. And just thinking, oh, competitiveness is what wins.
Mm.
But actually, sometimes when you have a competitive approach, nothing wrong with it, but it's understanding when it works and when it's not working. And sometimes the competitiveness can pull out and draw on that emotions in a less balanced way. So it's interesting. I think over time, I'm finding myself becoming more calm as a negotiator and
Mm.
remaining clear, regardless of whatever strategies or styles I'm faced with. And I think that's something that in my early 20s, I didn't have that perspective. It was like, I'm going to be competitive, I'm going to win, and I want to go back and give all the points of what I won that we originally planned as our objectives before we
And
came
it's
in.
interesting, Siobhan, going back to your first story. I think to your 20-year-old self now, if you were saying to them, calmer, clearer, more measured in your delivery, I think that in itself conveys confidence to the other side.
Yeah.
And people think she's not fazed by this. She's relaxed. She's confident.
Mm.
And I think that's something that maybe just comes with experience, but once the knowledge and the awareness is there, can be applied at any stage or any age of
Yeah.
I agree.
a negotiator's career.
But do you think as well, though, that whole sort of, you were talking about, that kind of aggressive, the sort of almost showboating, that's the way we do it. You get that without question. You get that at an industry level, at an organizational level. It becomes culturally embedded in an organization to the point that they need to be seen to do it that way. And nobody questions it. And it's funny, things crop up going through my head. I was thinking only a while ago where I was doing some training with a buying group who were relatively small in the great scheme of things. And we were trying to come up with flexible, creative ideas about how they could do more. And they said, this is great, but our bosses expect us to beat the living what's out of them. And what I was saying about the disconnect between kind of the power that you've really got and the power they think you have by behaving in a particular way. And they were saying, look, we want to do this, but whether we can get the buy-in at a senior level to understand that the world has shifted.
Yeah.
I come across organizations where, we might talk about sharing more information to manage expectations, structure their thoughts around where the deal might land. And they say, well, yeah, that's great, but culturally, we never give anything away. That's just company policy. And I'm not talking about breaching sort of confidential documents. I'm just talking about literally nothing can be shared because we just don't do that. Great if it's working all the time, but has anybody in the last 10 years stopped to challenge that particular piece of behavior, or is that just the way it is? And I think it's great to ask some of these questions of people and to try and get them to think about why they're doing it like they're doing it. And is it still right for their organization, as we launch into 2024? So, it's the question to all.
I wonder if there's a thing there about corporate culture not catching up with the evolution of behavior and awareness and all of the things that have developed over the last year in every respect, in terms of unconscious bias, in terms of kind of gender equality, all of that. And a lot of the kind of corporate culture has been set in decades gone by and is almost enforced still by people at very senior level who've been in the organization for decades, or who've been raised in this type of culture. So maybe there is that disconnect between the culture of the company and the way things have evolved.
Definitely. I think that cultural shift is so important because of the people higher up or managers or within the company that's setting the tone. I insist on it being the old way. That kind of limits, potential buyers or people in procurement adopting brand new approaches, because there's a pressure almost to keep a certain tone or way of going about negotiating. I think fortunately, like you've said, Anne, there are things shifting culturally that is helping kind of in society. So I can start to see that kind of dripping into various industries, and I hope it continues to do so. One of the wonderful things about lots of the work that's being done around International Women's Day is talking about the importance, on the topic of women, of us advocating for each other and lifting each other up. Of, if there is a woman who is in a role of experience and knowledge in the meeting, actually taking the chance, or might be somebody of another type of minority group, where you give them the opportunity to speak up, to share their expertise, to make sure their voice is being heard. And that is something that we can all do to lift each other up and start to shift. Actually, let's have this inclusive approach, and let's make sure everybody is heard and considered, which is one of the wonderful things, and what inspired us with this podcast, wasn't it? To share our different backgrounds, our different industry experience, and open up this conversation to raise awareness, really, and give people the opportunity to email in questions they have, or maybe challenges they've faced, or maybe even if people want to email in some of their fun stories that they are happy for us to share, that would be great, and we can give our perspective.
Or discuss, then we would love to hear from you.
Yeah. And that starts to shift the mindset, doesn't it? And I think that's all about celebrating each other and lifting each other up, which, I think it will make a difference if lots of us collectively are doing that. So, Annabel, have you got a particularly funny story related to power dynamics for negotiation?
Honestly, I have, and I'm itching to tell it. It's killing me because I've known this one for a very long time, and it's not actually me that was in the room, but it remains the finest conversation, or the finest recounting of a negotiation that I've heard. So apparently the lady that I got to know down the line was a kind of up and coming national account exec, and she went into a cash and carry to meet her new buyer. And she said, as she walked in to say hello to them, they're sitting behind their desk, older gentlemen, wearing a pair of antlers, those kind of deedly bopper antler things. And it wasn't even Christmas. This is what's so fascinating. It just wasn't Christmas, which is highly significant, because what she said was she sat down and it didn't come up straight away. So she didn't ask. So she didn't ask. So they didn't say. So this entire hour's meeting takes place with a little elasticy, spirally springs bouncing around with these antlers on their head, until eventually they said, thanks very much, shook hands, and arranged to meet again. And she said she just couldn't get it out of her head. Anyway, time goes on. They get to know each other. They do business together. And she said to him in the end, I've got to ask, what was with those antlers? What was the deal? And he said, well, I just wanted to see how you would handle the pressure. And to this day, I just don't understand where the pressure comes. But I think if I were to finish with a story, is to say, if you don't mind looking a complete chomp, then knock yourself out. But I really don't know what wearing antler was meant to achieve. But it remains my favourite power story to this day, I think. So
absolutely brilliant. Well, if any listeners have any fun stories they want to share with us, or any questions they want to send in, please email deal.divas@scotwork.com. We would love to hear from you, and we can answer any questions you have or share any fun stories you might like us to mention in the podcast. So that's it from us for today. And my name is Siobhan.
Annabel.
And Anne.
And we are the Deal Divas.